So, today I want to talk to you about how it is that we can do research of a scientific kind for something as complex as human behavior, as opposed to things that are simple like quantum physics or chemical analysis or biological exploration through a microscope. People are simply more complex than pretty much anything I can think of. And to do research on them, to understand how a human mind works, how a brain works, how society functions, and how relationships function, is complex and a challenging story. And the story of Clever Hands just goes to demonstrate that if animals are that complicated, then just imagine how complicated people are. So the usual thing is to run an experiment. You have a group of participants that volunteer and agree to the ethical codes that scientists must abide by, and then we can draw some conclusions based upon the experiments that those participants engage in. And there's a lot of dramatic stories. There's case studies, single stories, just like Clever Hands. And there's a lot of big discoveries that have taken place in various ways, and we'll really explore a lot of that within this course. Now, what we do is start off with a hypothesis. And from there, we have an educated guess, and we try to make a decision. So I'm going to talk to you today about research in psychology, and a funny thing about psychology, and I'll come back to that, is that, everybody really wants to be an amateur psychologist. Everybody wants to be an observer of people. And we live in a world where there's people like Dr. Phil and radio hosts and all sorts of people that use the fact that most people don't understand people to make themselves appear more intelligent. And the fact is, even psychologists are not mind readers, but we do experiments in order to discover the likelihood of certain things occurring. Now, here's a kind of sentence from a publication that just drives psychologists crazy. Almost half of children of divorces enter adult as worried, underachieving, self-deprecating, and sometimes angry young men and women. And that sounds like a psychological study of some kind, right? That somebody wants to argue about the importance of divorce and breakdown of the family. So just think about it for a moment. Almost half of children of divorce enter adulthood as worried. Well, worried about what? Worried about crime in your community? Worried about whether or not you're going to have a job when you graduate from college? Worried about who you're going to find to be in a relationship? Worried about foreign wars? Worried about the economy? Worried about COVID-19? Worried about your health? Of course people are worried. So the fact that that statement doesn't tell you or make a clear connection between worry and divorce is very misleading. And so it's very important for us to ensure that we always look at statements with a critical eye. Now, here's another thing. It says they're underachieving. Well, underachieving compared to what? Compared to what someone says? There's no evidence in this statement that somebody can prove that someone is underachieving scientifically. It's just a statement in order to move the emotion along, to move the mythic level. Self-deprecating? Well, sometimes I think that It's actually kind of nice for a person to be modest. It's not bad to be modest and to self-deprecate on occasion, especially if it's an accurate perspective of yourself. Now, pathological self-deprecation, that's a completely different story, but that headline doesn't say anything about that. And they're angry young men and women. Well, have you been angry in the last year? Societies break down, relationships break down. We have disappointments in life. That doesn't mean it was caused necessarily by divorce. Even when there's a correlation, that does not mean causation. And that's what I want us to think about today is, how do you know what is true? How do you know what is accurate? How do you know what the answer is? Yes, clever Hans was smart, but that the message that was given, that he could read and write German, that he could do math and all those things, were not true. The same thing with what we know to be true. We know to be true things 99% of the time because either we hear them all the time or someone in authority tells us. But as university students, it's important for us to analyze what is true. Our parents told us what was true. Our teachers told us what was true. Our textbooks tell us what is true. But we need to always look behind that statement of truth to see whether or not it is correct. The role of science, and particularly the scientific study of psychology, is to continually refine, to hold on what holds up, and to let fall away what does not hold up to the evidence. So there are things like repetition or tenacity. You hear something often enough and people tend to believe it. A priori, what's reasonable? You think things through just by thought, what's possible, rational, and so on. And then we have scientific analysis, where we have a hypothesis and we test that hypothesis with various experiments and see where the numbers lead us. What we're always trying to do is disprove the null hypothesis statistically. In psychology, it's next to impossible to prove something to be true, and so what we do is we prove that something is untrue or likely untrue, statistically likely untrue. And in so doing, then we can accept the reasonable alternative hypothesis. So we're always trying to disprove the null hypothesis and accept the alternative hypothesis within statistical, quantitative, experimental research within psychology. So what makes something an experiment? Well, you need to start off with two things conceptually. The first is the dependent variable, what you measure, the outcome, and the independent variable, what you vary. And once you have those things in an experiment, you kind of are on your way to having an experiment, at least in the broad sense of the word. So in psychology, it took a long time to figure this out. It wasn't until the 1800s that people had kind of an approach to doing experiments in psychology and figuring out, for example, how to use the simple measurement of time to measure how long a mental operation lasts in your mind. So, pretty cool way to start. Wilhelm Wundt, one of the big figures in experimental psychology, set up the first laboratory in psychology. And he did the following test of mental chronometry. What he simply did was he measured how long it takes to do something. So he would show you a light, and you'd simply press the button. And that would take about 1/5 of a second. And then he would say, instead, you do this. If the light turns on and it's red, you push one button. And if it's green, you push another. So his idea was the motor system to push the button is about the same. The time to observe the light is about the same. But the difference between these two is how long it takes to make a choice. How long it takes to make a choice is what he was looking at. And that difference, when he subtracts them, took about 1/10 of the time by that measurement. So all of a sudden, he could start to measure in an objective sense how long a mental operation takes in your mind. Then psychology went in a lot of different directions, and a famous direction comes from Tickner, who worked with Wundt and developed a psychology department at Cornell. And he was interested in introspection, looking inside of yourself to think very carefully. And when you think about a topic, how do you think about it? That's what he was interested in. And so from a scientific method, that seemed to lose its way. There was nothing testable there. It was a private process. Introspection is a private process. And while there's a lot of introspection in various types of psychological research, for the purposes of this class, we're going to continue to focus on psychology as a science, and a quantitative experimental science specifically, because a lot of the growth that took place in the early part of the 20th century was in response to some of the loosey-goosey introspection that was taking place within psychology. And one of the famous researchers that came along in response to this loosey-goosey introspection was a fellow by the name of John B. Watson, who was known as the father of behaviorism. And he said the mind is unobservable. So we can only study behavior, things that people do. Remember, the mythic level is the subjective level. The phenomena are behaviors. Those are the things that we can study. And then we take those behaviors and bring them back to our mythic level and rewrite our mythic stories about how we understand people. And so we can only study behavior, things that people do, actions that people take, how their mouth moves, when they press a button with their hand, that sort of thing. And then we identify as well the environmental influences on behavior. So we start to look at what are the things that influence animal and human behavior. How do we respond to stimuli within the environment? And we can do this by using a stimulus. And you can control a stimulus as a scientist. And then there's a response. And you can measure that response. And that is how psychology as an experimental science really started to grow. Now, so behaviorism became a very strong part of what psychology was up until about the 1980s. And then there became a cognitive revolution. And again, there seemed to be a bit of a struggle between the scientific side of cognition and the introspective side of cognition. But fortunately, we were starting to learn new ways of measuring brain function and having different machines and tools to be able to measured the electrical flow, for example, within the brain, and then we were able to see objective representations of what was going on within a person's mind. And that was enabling us to move cognitive psychology in a wonderfully scientific direction. Now, if you remember Clever Hans, there was a correlation between people asking him questions and him giving the answers. But the correlation does not denote causation. One doesn't cause the other. Just like divorce does not necessarily be the only cause of bitterness and lack of success in children later in life. Causation must be determined through rigorous experiments. And in those experiments, there needs to be a time-order relationship, there needs to be an elimination of other causal factors, and there needs to be a clear delineation between the cause and the effect. So, for example, if I say 100% of people that are in jail for murder eat bread. Therefore, bread causes murder. Well, obviously that's wrong. There are lots of other factors that you can look at, and when you start to parse things out, you see that eating bread is just an extraneous variable. So there are lots of cases like that when you're looking at research, and so you need to always be mindful, critical consumers of research. And that's part of the reason why we want you to understand something of research as you study psychology, so that you can start to parse out what is good information versus what is bad information, or at least incomplete information. Although, to be fair, all research is incomplete in some way. What we're going to do now is transition a little bit and explore other ways of exploring research within psychology. And there's some very interesting approaches that are used that aren't necessarily explicitly experimental, but nevertheless can reveal some interesting things about what is going on within the human mind. What I'd like to do here is take a little bit of time and talk about the development of the history of systematic research within psychology. Now, I'm going to narrow in here, and because there are so many broad categories of psychology, I'm going to narrow in on child developmental psychology, because that's a fairly interesting field. And one of the first glimmers of a scientific and systematic study of children can be traced back really to the late 19th century. And this was a period in which investigators from a variety of academic backgrounds began to observe the development of their own children and to publish this data in what are known as works of baby biographies. Now, I should note here that nowadays it would be considered unethical to do experiments in your own child, although technically they didn't do experiments, they just did observations. So an early and very influential baby biographer was none other than Charles Darwin, the originator of the evolutionary theory. And what Charles Darwin did was he made daily records of the early development of his son. And Darwin's curiosity about childhood really stemmed from his theory of evolution. And quite simply, he believed that young, untrained infants share many characteristics with their non-human ancestors. And what he did is he advanced a theory that since has been discredited, that is the idea that the development of the individual child retraces the entire evolutionary history of the species, thereby illustrating the descent of man, as he called it. So, Darwin and many of his contemporaries viewed the baby biography as a means of answering questions about our evolutionary past. Now, a few decades after Darwin came Clara and William Stern, and they kept one of the most systematic diaries of the psychological development of their three children, Hilda, Gunther, and Eva, born in 1900, 1902, and 1904 respectively. And this became a major publication about the diaries of these children, and it was called Children's Talk, or Die Kindersprach in German, which became really a classic in the development of understanding children. And several decades after this, Jean Piaget, who was a famous Swiss psychologist and someone you will hear about lots in psychology, observed and recorded the development of his three children, Jacqueline, Lucien, and Laurent. And he used these observations to develop more fine-grained methods for studying the development of logical thinking in children. And his theories really revolutionized our understanding of children's cognitive development. So it isn't that these non-scientific ways of observation did not lead to knowledge, but they were simply a foundation for other ways of better, more scientific knowledge. Now, some other ways of gathering data and finding facts that we have now developed are things like self-report methods, and there are three common procedures that developmentalists will use to gather information and to test hypotheses. And these are interviews, questionnaires, including psychological tests, and the clinical method. And although these approaches are similar in that each asks participants to answer questions posed by the investigator, they differ in the extent to which the investigator treats individual participants alike. So in the interview and question method, researchers who opt for interview and question techniques ask the child or the participant or the child's parents a series of questions pertaining to such aspects as development of the child's behavior, their feelings, their beliefs or characteristics, methods of thinking, and they collect data via a questionnaire. And most psychological tests simply involve putting questions in written or electronic formats and asking participants to respond to them, whereas interviews require participants to respond orally to the investigator's queries. And if the procedure is a structured interview or structured questionnaire, all who participate in the study are asked the same questions in the same order. And the purpose of the standardized or structured format is to treat each person alike, so that the responses of different participants can be compared. Then there is the clinical method. And the clinical method is very similar to the interview technique. And here the investigator is usually interested in testing a hypothesis by presenting the research participant with a task or stimulus of some sort and then inviting a response. And after the participant responds, the investigator typically asks a second question or introduces a new task to clarify the participant's original answer. Now, although participants are often asked the same question initially, each participant's answer determines what he or she is asked next. So, the clinical method is a flexible approach that considers each participant as unique. Now, Jean Piaget, as I've already mentioned, did not only observe his own children, but he also relied extensively on the clinical method to study children's intellectual development and even a child's moral reasoning skills. And the data from Piaget's research are largely protocol records of his interactions with individual children. So, for example, here's an example of Piaget's work on the development of the moral reasoning, which shows that a young child thinks about lying in a very different way than adults do. So, he asks the question, do you know what a lie is? It's when you say what isn't true. Is 2 plus 2 equals 5 a lie? Yes, it's a lie. Why? Because it isn't right. Did the boy who said 2 plus 2 equals 5 know it wasn't right? Or did he make a mistake? He made a mistake. Then if he made a mistake, did he tell a lie or not? Yes, he told a lie. So that just shows you some ways that you can do observations and get some very different and interesting ways of gathering knowledge. There are also case studies, and in a case study, you're really interested in looking at the details of a single individual and how they function. And so it involves collecting records and cases and interviewing people and collecting information about family background and socioeconomic status and health records and academic records and work history and performances and psychological tests. And it's a very in-depth process. There's also an ethnography, and that's a form of participatory observation, often used in the field of anthropology, but also used in cultural psychology, where a person engages within a culture and they collect data about the culture while being engaged within the culture. It can often be very diverse and immersive in the ways that you go about collecting the data, but it can bring about some very rich understandings of the complexities of something like the impact of culture upon a person. Then there are psychophysiological methods. And increasingly, psychologists have turned to psychophysiological methods and techniques that measure the relationship between physiological responses and behavior to explore the biological underpinnings of things like perception, cognition, and emotional responses. And this, too, is a very interesting field where you can use what is called a MRI, a magnetic resonance imaging, or a fMRI, a functional magnetic resonance imaging, or something like eye tracking or electroencephalograms. Lots of different ways of gathering information about the body's response. So, overall, I just want you to be mindful of the fact that there are lots of different ways of collecting information and data, but ultimately it comes down to what does the experimental data say? Because the experimental design is precise in how it questions the development of knowledge and will help you to delineate any issues, just like what we had in the case of Clever Hands. I hope you enjoyed this week as we explored the science and advancement of knowledge within psychology. And I'll see you next week. You take care. Bye-bye.